This presentation is titled Partition Oracles from Wiki Forgeries and is joint work between myself and Carlos Sid. In this presentation, I'm going to explain the title. So first we need to go over what are partition oracles, and then what are wikis, and then lastly I can describe our contribution. Okay, so to begin, partition oracles, and I'm going to explain this via an example. Okay, so Alice is communicating with Bob via a proxy server. So to do that, Alice and Bob share a symmetric key. Sorry, Alice and the proxy server share a symmetric key. So first, Alice will encrypt her IP port and request with that symmetric key, and then send it to the proxy server. The proxy server can decrypt it and send the request on. When it receives a response, it can then encrypt that response with the shared key and send it back to Alice. So Alice is able to bypass this firewall in the diagram by using a proxy server, because the firewall is unable to see the contents of Alice's requests because they're encrypted. Okay, so as I'm sure you've noticed, the notion of encryption is authenticated encryption here. So ciphertexts have to be authentic. They have to have been encrypted with the secret key that Alice and the proxy server share. So if I send a ciphertext to the proxy server, that should be rejected unless I happen to know what Alice's secret key is. So what I could do to try and guess Alice's secret key is just compose a ciphertext under some key, submit it to the proxy server, and if it's accepted, then I will find out what Alice's key is in a so-called brute force attack. Now, if I can send a ciphertext that decrypts correctly under two keys, say, then when I observe that the ciphertext is accepted by the proxy server, I know that the key that Alice and the proxy server are using is one of those two keys. So that allows me to query two keys at a time, speeding up my brute force by a factor of 2. And that's the basic idea here. If we're able to construct ciphertext that will decrypt under multiple keys, then it's possible to speed up a brute force attack. So partition oracles were introduced at Usenix by Len, Grubbs and Ristenpart. And abstractly, a partitioning oracle can be thought of as a black box taking a ciphertext and a partition of the key space and revealing which part the user's key is in. So thinking about authenticated encryption, partition oracles can be obtained from a decryption oracle and the ability to craft so-called splitting ciphertexts. So the idea is that you have a ciphertext that would decrypt under any of the keys in a set of target keys, K star. And when that ciphertext is sent to a decryption oracle, observing that the ciphertext decrypts correctly tells you that the key is in K star, and if not, then the key is in the complement of K star. So you've partitioned the key space. And I'm going to formalize that in the next slide with this game, TMKCR, standing for Targeted Multi-Key Collision Resistance. So the idea is that an adversary is able to craft ciphertexts that decrypt correctly under all of the keys in a target set of keys K star, is able to win this targeted multi-key collision resistance game. There's also a notion of untargeted, so just MKCR, which is similar, but the adversary is trying to craft ciphertexts that will decrypt under a set of target keys, but it doesn't have to specify that set. It just needs to find a set that is big enough, basically. Okay. So one way to win this TMKCR game is by exploiting a lack of key commitment. For authenticated encryption, key commitment states that a ciphertext will only decrypt under the key that was used to encrypt it. So Len, Grubbs, and Ristenpart exploit the inherent lack of key commitment for polynomial hash-based AAD, and they do that by constructing a ciphertext that decrypts under every key in a set of target keys. So that was their contribution. And then just to note that there are two generic ways to make AAD schemes committing, so-called padding fix. You can prepend a constant string of messages, a constant string to messages before encrypting, and then check for that string on decrypting, which isn't generically secure, but it is secure for AES-GCM and CHA-20 Poly 1305, which are the two kind of most common polynomial hash-based AAD schemes. And there's also the generic fix. So from a symmetric key, you can derive a key for encryption and then a second key, which is a commitment to that key using collision-resistant hash functions. Okay, so now to describe weak keys. So the concept of weak keys shares some similarities with that of partition oracles. And a weak key is a key that results in an algorithm behaving in an unexpected way that can easily be detected. So the idea is that a weak key can be tested for with less effort than brute force. And in some work from 2013, Proctor and Sid give a framework that neatly captures weak key forgeries. So that is forgeries that are valid if the key is weak. Okay, so I'm going to describe that now. But first, I need to describe what polynomial hashing involves. So polynomial hashing takes as input an authentication key H and a message M, which could be a plain text or a ciphertext. And first, split M into blocks and add the length of the message, with each of these blocks considered as an element of a field. And then construct this polynomial gm of x, which is a polynomial that has coefficients, which are the blocks of the messages, and is an element of the polynomials over that field f. So then to obtain the polynomial hash of a message, you evaluate this polynomial at h, so at the hashing key. Okay, and that's written out here, and that will give you an element of the field. And the hash value is usually encrypted with a pseudo-random one-time pad to provide the output authentication tag. So the idea behind weak key forgeries is just that we have a polynomial. If you add on something that is zero valued, you don't change the value of the hash. Okay, so let Q of X be a polynomial such that the polynomial evaluated at H gives 0. Then if you think about the hash of the message, which is this polynomial G of M at H, that is equal to GM of H plus Q of H, because Q of H is 0, which, because of the associativity of addition, is equal to G of M plus Q of H, and that by definition is the hash of M plus Q, where Q, capital Q, is the concatenation of the coefficients of the polynomial Q of X, and the addition is done blockwise. Okay, so this gives a formula, if you like, for constructing forgeries. And the forgery works if you have the hashing key H known. Okay. All right, so now to describe partition oracles from weak keys. Abstractly, weak key forgeries and splitting ciphertexts share the same structure. Ciphertexts whose successful decryption is contingent on the user's key being in a set of target keys. And this suggests that weak key forgeries are a good candidate to carry out partition oracle attacks. And in our work, we show that this is indeed the case. So we generalize the attack formalization of Len et al. To allow the adversary to act as a machine in the middle in a more realistic reflection of an attacker's capabilities. As a result, we obtain a more abstract definition that encompasses weak key forgeries and splitting ciphertexts. So this was actually the notion of targeted multi-key collision resistance that I showed in slide 3. Yeah, so Len et al. Just think about submitting ciphertext that decrypt under multiple keys, but we allow the adversary to see a ciphertext first before they construct their splitting ciphertext. And yeah, we show how to carry out a partition oracle attack using weak key forgeries and discuss some practical applications of the attack. So that's a high-level overview of the contributions of the paper. Okay, so partition oracles from weak keys. And I'm going to use ASGCM as an example. So for ASGCM, there's the encryption, which I'm not going to talk about, and there's the authentication component, which is done by something called ghash. So to calculate the authentication component, the tag, first pass C as 128-bit blocks, interpreted as elements of F2 to the 128, and then the length of C is going to be encoded as capital L. So first take the encryption key K, and you obtain the hash key by encrypting a block of all zeros. And then the hash of the ciphertext is this polynomial evaluation. So that is the same as before, with the order slightly changed, but the idea is the same. And then the authentication tag is that hash value XORed with a one-time pad of an encryption with K of a counter. Okay, so this is the definition of ghash, and it's just useful to have that on the page. Okay, so then our partition oracle from weak keys, we're going to construct a ciphertext that is a weak key forgery that would decrypt correctly under any of the keys in a set of target keys. Okay, so our attack has two phases, offline and online. And in the offline phase, first going to input a set of target keys, K star, then derive the associated ghash keys, and then set polynomial Q of X as the polynomial which is the product of X plus H, where H is in H star. So as you notice, if we substitute any of the H's into here, we get a polynomial that will evaluate to 0. Okay, and yeah, I'd like to refer to this as a forgery mask. So that's the offline phase, so that's pre-prepared. And in the online phase, we now obtain a ciphertext together with a nonce tag. And we're going to pass the ciphertext into blocks and let alpha and beta be constants. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then construct Q prime. So we're going to update the forgery mask using A plus B, where A and B are derived from alpha and beta according to this formula. And set Q prime as the coefficients of the polynomial Q prime. And the important thing to note here is that the value of Q prime L plus 1, so that kind of corresponds to the length, is given by alpha by construction, and Q1 prime is equal to beta, again by construction. So now C hat, the splitting ciphertext, is going to be the XOR between C star and Q prime, where C star is really just the ciphertext that's been 0 padded to meet the same length as Q prime. Okay, and we've specified that L has a certain length so that we are actually adding, or so that Q prime is longer than C star. Okay, so now if the key K is in the set of target keys K star, together with two extra keys, KL and 0, then for a hash key which is derived from that key, you get hash of the splitting ciphertext is equal to, so by definition, that's the length of that splitting ciphertext times h plus blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's just putting that into the definition of G hash. And then the length of C hat by construction, that's equal to alpha XORed with length C, which is equal to so that is, so now we have the polynomial which is equal to the addition of Q prime H XORed with a hash of C. So if Q prime of H equals 0, equivalently if H is is derived from a key which is in this set of K star together with KL and the 0 key, then we have a valid forgery. So we've been able to construct a ciphertext that will decrypt correctly in a set of keys that we know. So we can now test all of these keys basically. So we have a way to do a partition oracle. Okay, so performance. Our attack is limited to scenarios where keys are deterministically derived from passwords. If passwords are salted using randomly generated salts, then pre-computation is no longer feasible. So an attacker can prepare a collection of ciphertext masks corresponding to disjoint target key sets with the highest aggregate probabilities. So what I mean by that is you can create a ciphertext mask with corresponding to all of the keys that are based on passwords that are the most likely. So that would be your first one. And then your second ciphertext mask would be the set of the next most likely passwords. Okay. The offline phase need only occur once, which allows the adversary to amortize the upfront cost of pre-computation over multiple targets, which is especially useful in cases where generating target keys from passwords is particularly slow. And we assume that the cost of querying a ciphertext is low and that either there's a steady supply of ciphertext to intercept, or it is possible to reuse the same nonce, which may or may not be possible depending on whether the server enforces unique nonces. Okay, so in conclusion, partition oracle attacks using weak key forgeries are more efficient than brute force if querying a decryption oracle is cheap and the weak key forgeries can be computed in advance. And if I go back, so by construction, this beta is just any constant. So it's possible to specify what that beta is, which means that actually we have control over the first block of the underlying plain text. So that's actually very nice. And it means that our attacks are valid in settings that are resistant to the attack of limit L, in particular, where there are format requirements on underlying plain texts, including format requirements that are designed to render schemes key committing. So earlier we talked about prepending one block of all zeros, or for example, or some fixed block and checking for that block on decrypting, and that being a way to obtain a key committing scheme. But we can meet that format requirement because we have control over the underlying plain text, or the first block thereof. Or in some setting where there's a protocol that requires some format, some prefix, we can meet that, which is very nice, I think. So our results reinforce the conclusions of Lin et al., especially on the danger of deriving encryption keys from user-generated passwords. And lastly, our results suggest that resistance to weak key forgeries should be considered a related design goal to key commitment. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation.